His hand was on the hospital door until her voice stopped him cold. "You don't get to show up now." Selah stood firm, eyes wet but unflinching. What would you do if the man who abandoned your mother returned when she was too weak to speak? This isn't just a story about loss. It's about timing, truth, and the kind of love that doesn't always come wrapped in the right moments. Stay with me, because what unfolds next may change how you see forgiveness. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Your support keeps stories like this alive. May you be reminded today that your love, patience, and strength matter deeply. Long before the silence, there was music. Alara moved through life with a rhythm all her own. Soft-spoken but never unsure, she was the kind of woman who made you feel seen. She painted without ever picking up a brush. Through her kindness, her words, her presence, she remembered the names of flowers, of birds, of the neighbors' children. She carried old love songs in her head and whistled them while hanging laundry or slicing apples for a pie. She lived a simple life, but not because she lacked dreams. She had once dreamed of cities, of midnight walks on cobblestone streets, of becoming a counselor, helping women rediscover their voice. She wanted a home full of books and laughter, and someone who would walk beside her, not ahead. She met Caleb in her final year of college. He wasn't like the others. He didn't ask small questions. He challenged her, pushed her to think bigger, sharper. His energy was intense, electric. The first time they kissed, she said it felt like the world stopped spinning for just a moment. They were fire and calm, drive and grace. He whispered promises about the future, how he'd build something world-changing and she would be his balance. He spoke of private jets, of international summits, of his name on billboards. She never asked for any of that. All she wanted was to be chosen fully, not partially, not conditionally. At first he called every night, sent her voice notes at 2 a.m. about business ideas and sleepless ambition. But the closer he came to success, the farther he drifted from her. His calls became shorter. Then came the silence. When she found out she was pregnant, she waited a week to tell him. She didn't want to trap him. She wanted to give him a chance to show who he really was. And he did. He offered her a condo, medical care, a monthly allowance. He offered security, but not love, not partnership, not presence. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't plead. She packed her bags, quietly walked away, and never looked back. She returned to Vermont, to her childhood home, and decided her life wasn't ending, it was beginning. Alone, yes, but not broken. The twins were born on a warm spring morning. Riven first, his eyes alert, searching. Selah followed, crying loud and strong. From the moment she held them, Alara felt full again. Not because she had everything, but because she had purpose. For 18 years, Caleb never visited. Not once. There were no gifts, no letters, no calls. Occasionally, Alara would see his face on a screen during business news segments, flanked by executives, celebrated by investors. She never changed the channel out of spite. She simply didn't want the noise. People asked her how she did it, how she raised 2 children on her own, kept a warm home, and smiled through the ache. She would answer with a gentle shrug and say, "Some things are worth choosing twice. My children were one of them." She never filled their heads with bitterness. When they asked about their father, she told them the truth, but left space for them to decide what that truth meant. She said, "He was brilliant, but not ready. Some people mistake progress for leaving others behind. That's not your fault." But in private, there were nights when Alara sat by the window and wondered if he ever thought of them, if he'd ever felt the absence, not of responsibility, but of memory, of birthday candles he never lit, of snowmen never built, of voices he never heard calling him Dad. She forgave him quietly, for her own sake, but forgetting was something else entirely. As the twins grew, Alara taught them not just how to survive, but how to see the world with depth. She showed them how to listen, truly listen, to the pauses in people's sentences, to what wasn't being said. She taught them how to hold their heads high, even when they felt small. Riven was quiet, precise. From an early age he noticed patterns, how Alara sorted the pantry, alphabetically, how she hummed the same melody when deep in thought. He liked order, structure, but beneath that thoughtful exterior was a young man who watched everything and held on to little moments like they were pieces of gold. Selah was fire. She didn't just feel emotions, she spoke them, painted them in language, wrote them into poems tucked under her pillow. She once told Alara, "When I'm older, I want to write stories about women who don't need to be saved. Ilara smiled and replied, "Start with mine." They never had excess, but they had enough. Ilara kept them fed, clothed, and loved. Their clothes were handed down, their shoes a little scuffed, but their sense of identity was untouched. Every night before bed she would whisper to them, "You are not missing anything. You have everything you need already inside you." She never cried in front of them about Calum, but one night, when Riven was 13, he walked past her room and saw her sitting at the edge of her bed, holding an envelope she never opened. It was from a lawyer, something about shares, legal rights, options. Riven didn't ask. She didn't explain, but he remembered that night. Not because of what she said, but because of what she didn't. In school, when other kids made Father's Day cards, Selah would fold hers into paper cranes. When Riven was asked once if his dad was the famous guy from TV, he nodded but said nothing more. They didn't hate Calum. In truth, they didn't know how to. You can't hate what was never given a chance to exist. But they did feel the hole, the silence between their mother's strength and her solitude. They could see it in the way she paused during family game nights, her smile fading just for a second before returning. They could feel it when she sat alone at school concerts, clapping the loudest, laughing the longest. Still, they were proud of the mother who built something whole from something broken, who chose to stay soft in a world that tried to make her hard, who raised them not to chase revenge, but to choose grace when possible. As the years passed, Riven excelled in science and math. He designed an app at 16 that helped elderly patients manage their medications. Selah won regional poetry contests and read her work at public libraries, her voice unwavering even when her hands trembled. Ilara never missed a single event. They built a life, a good one. But no matter how full it was, there was one door left unopened, the one that led back to him. Sometimes, late at night, Selah would wonder what it would have been like to grow up with a father who sat in the front row of her recitals. Riven would wonder what it might have been like to have someone help him with his coding projects, someone who shared his logic and instinct. But they never said these things aloud, because to speak it felt like betrayal, and they refused to betray the woman who had given them everything. Ilara aged quietly. She never remarried. When asked why, she would smile and say once was enough. But privately, she held on to small things, a first note from Calum written on the back of a napkin, a faded photograph of them by a riverside, his old cufflink tucked inside a wooden box, not because she still loved him, but because those moments helped her remember the version of herself who once believed in forever. She never told the twins about those keepsakes, not because she was ashamed, but because she wanted them to see her as whole, not someone still carrying pieces of a man who never returned. Still, life had its quiet betrayals. One day, her knees began to ache. Then came the dizzy spells, the tiredness that sleep couldn't fix. She kept it from them at first. She said it was just age, just stress. But mothers always know when to speak and when to shield. And Ilara had shielded long enough. By the time the doctor uttered the diagnosis, her children were no longer children. They sat beside her, hands clenched, jaws tight, trying to stay strong. That was the beginning of the next chapter. But in order to understand what came next, you had to know the foundation, the years of love built in silence, the strength it took to walk away, the courage it took to raise 2 lives while mourning the shadow of a man who had chosen something else. Because stories like this don't begin at the hospital door. They begin the moment someone says, "I choose peace, even if it costs me everything." Riven and Selah did not grow up loud, but they grew up full. Their days followed a steady rhythm shaped by Ilara's quiet consistency. Mornings began early, not because they had to, but because she believed the day deserved respect. Breakfast was simple. Conversation was not. Ilara listened closely to every thought, every half-formed idea, every worry they carried to the table. Riven spoke less, but when he did, his words were measured. He liked certainty. Numbers made sense to him. Systems made sense. He was the kind of child who dismantled broken clocks just to see how time worked on the inside. Ilara never scolded him for it. She handed him a notebook instead and said, "Write down what you learn." Selah, on the other hand, spoke as if words lived inside her chest and needed air. She noticed emotions the way some people notice weather shifts. She felt changes before they were named. At 10 years old, she wrote her first poem after watching her mother sit alone on the porch one evening. She never showed it to anyone, but she kept writing after that. Ilara encouraged both without comparison. She never told Riven to be more expressive or Selah to be more practical. She understood that love didn't mean shaping children into what the world wanted, but protecting who they already were. The twins noticed the absence early, even though it was never explained in detail. They noticed it when Ilara carried groceries alone, when she fixed loose boards herself, when there was no second voice offering advice, no second pair of shoes by the door. But what they never noticed was bitterness. Ilara did not let absence become a lesson in resentment. When questions came, she answered honestly, but gently. He wasn't ready, she once said. Some people aren't. Riven stored that sentence away. Selah felt it settle somewhere deep. As they grew older, the contrast between what they inherited and what they were taught became clearer. Riven had his father's sharp mind, the ability to assess quickly, to detach emotionally when needed. But Ilara taught him responsibility, humility, and restraint. She reminded him that intelligence without compassion could become a weapon. Selah had Ilara's emotional awareness, but she also carried a spark of intensity that didn't come from her mother. It showed in the way she questioned unfairness, in the way she refused to let uncomfortable truths stay hidden. Ilara guided that fire carefully, teaching her how to express pain without causing harm. Their bond as twins was unspoken but strong. They defended each other without discussion. If one felt uneasy, the other sensed it. If one struggled, the other adjusted without complaint. By the time they reached adulthood, they'd built a shared understanding of the world, one where love was action, not promise, where presence mattered more than words. Ilara watched them with quiet pride. She attended every milestone. She sat through long science fairs, poetry readings, late-night conversations about fear and ambition. She never missed a moment that mattered, even when her body began to ask for rest. At first, the signs were small. She forgot appointments. She grew tired faster. Some mornings she paused before standing, as if gathering strength from the floor beneath her feet. When the twins asked, she brushed it off. "Just age," she said with a smile. Riven didn't believe her. He began watching more closely. Selah felt it even before it showed. The morning everything changed began like any other. Ilara stood in the kitchen, reaching for her tea, when her hand slipped. The cup shattered against the floor. She tried to speak, but her words tangled. Her vision blurred. Selah caught her before she fell. Riven was already dialing for help, his voice steady even as his hands shook. Time moved strangely after that. Voices overlapped. Doors opened and closed. Ilara was placed on a stretcher, her face pale but calm, as if she didn't want to frighten them. "It's okay," she whispered. "I'm right here." Those words stayed with them. At the hospital, the waiting felt endless. Riven paced. Selah sat with her arms wrapped around herself, silently praying for strength she didn't know how to ask for. When the doctor finally spoke, the words were careful, but the meaning was heavy. An aggressive condition, long-standing, serious. Neither twin spoke at first. They took turns sitting beside Ilara's bed. They adjusted her blanket. They brushed her hair back when it fell into her eyes. They told her about ordinary things, about work, about books, about a poem Selah was writing but hadn't finished. They did not talk about fear. They did not talk about what might come next. They stayed, and in that stillness, something else settled between them, a shared resolve. Whatever happened, they would protect her peace. They would guard her space. They would not allow the past to invade this fragile moment. Because for them, family had always been defined by who stayed when it mattered, and that belief was about to be tested. The first night in the hospital was the hardest. Selah stayed curled in the chair beside their mother's bed, arms folded tight. Across her chest, fighting the exhaustion that tried to drag her under, Riven paced in short, rigid lines outside the room, unwilling to sit, unable to rest. His thoughts ran faster than his breath could keep up. Ilara slept, her face still and pale, breathing slow, steady. Machines whispered beside her, lights blinked softly. She looked smaller in that bed, frailer, like someone slowly fading from the edges inward. Selah reached out and took her mother's hand. It felt cool, but not cold. She traced the lines on her palm the way she used to when she was little, when Ilara would rub her back during storms and hum softly until her fear melted away. "She's going to be okay," Riven said from the doorway. Selah didn't answer right away. "You don't know that—" He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I need to believe it." She nodded. Me too. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy with everything they couldn't say. Fear, guilt, the sense that the world they knew had tilted, and there was no guide for how to walk straight again. Later, a nurse came in with test results and quiet explanations. Autoimmune. Severe. Sudden, but not without warning signs. It had been in her body for years, quietly taking space, damaging from the inside. Riven blamed himself for not seeing it sooner. Selah blamed herself for brushing off the signs. Neither of them said it aloud. Instead, they took shifts sleeping in the room. They called their professors, put work on pause. They rearranged their lives around her recovery as if that alone could will her into healing. And through it all, they kept her room quiet, peaceful, protected, not just from noise, but from disruption. There was an unspoken understanding between them. No one entered unless they belonged. The past had already taken enough. It wouldn't be allowed to take more, not now. 3 days passed. Alara stirred in and out of awareness, asking soft questions, sometimes mumbling names or moments they didn't recognize. Selah would jot them down in her notebook, wondering if they were fragments of dreams or memories too deep to be held any longer. Riven asked about advanced treatment options, spoke with specialists, read articles late into the night until the words blurred. He didn't believe in waiting. He believed in action. And yet, this was something he couldn't fix with logic alone. On the 4th morning, Selah stepped outside to get some air. The sun had just begun to rise, casting a dim gold across the parking lot. She stood there, breathing in the cold, trying to convince herself that everything would return to normal soon. That's when she saw it. A black car, doors that opened too smoothly, 2 men in suits stepping out first, and then him. Her stomach dropped. There were no questions, no hesitation. Her body reacted before her mind caught up. She walked straight back inside. When Riven saw her face, he knew something was wrong. "What is it?" She didn't answer, just pointed down the hall. He stood and followed her to the main doors. Calum had not changed in the way time changes most people. He carried himself like someone who still expected rooms to shift for him. The same trimmed beard, the same perfectly tailored coat. But there was something else in his eyes now, something that looked like hesitation. Selah stepped forward and blocked his path before he could speak. "You need to leave." He looked at her, startled. He hadn't expected resistance. Not like this. "I came to see her." "You lost that right," she said quietly. Riven moved beside her, calm but firm. "You had 18 years, he said. "You don't get to walk in now and pretend you care." "I do care," Calum replied, voice low. "I've made mistakes, but—" "You made choices," Selah snapped, "and we lived with them." He opened his mouth to respond, but Riven cut in. "She doesn't need a performance. She needs peace." Calum looked past them, toward the hallway leading to the room. He didn't move. Selah's voice cracked just slightly when she spoke again. "We're not here to protect your conscience. We're here to protect her." He nodded slowly. "I'm not trying to take anything from you." "You already did," Riven said. "You just didn't notice." And with that, the moment ended. They turned their backs, walked away. He didn't follow. What would you do if your world turned upside down in one morning? Let us know in the comments. The news came not through a call or message, but a presence. It began with the sound of polished shoes hitting the linoleum floor. Uniform steps, sharp turns. 2 suited men entered the hospital like they were walking into a boardroom. One stood near the front desk, the other scanned the hallway. Riven saw them first. He'd just stepped out of Alara's room to refill her water when his eyes caught the dark suits and alert expressions. Not security, not staff, something else. Selah joined him seconds later. And then he appeared. Calum Virel. It had been over 18 years, yet there was no mistaking him. He moved like someone used to being watched. Perfect posture, clean cut, coat without a wrinkle. His expression was unreadable, carved in stone. But there was hesitation in his step, a flicker in his gaze that betrayed the power he was used to hiding behind. The moment felt strange, too quiet, as if time had paused out of discomfort. Selah stepped forward first. Riven stood beside her. Calum halted a few feet away, clearly waiting for the right opening to speak. "I heard about Alara," he began, voice low, almost measured. "I came as soon as I could." He glanced past them, toward the room at the end of the corridor. Selah didn't move. Her tone didn't waver. "You're not walking in there." Caleb blinked once, taken aback, not by the words but by the lack of fear behind them. "I'm her husband," he said. "No," Riven replied evenly. "You're the man who left her." Caleb glanced between them, searching their faces. He looked like someone trying to recall memories from a life he barely lived. "I know I wasn't there." "You weren't there," Selah cut in. "By choice." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Don't insult her by showing up now like it erases the years she cried quietly in the next room." "I never meant to hurt her," he said. Riven answered with silence, not because he didn't have words, but because none of them could carry what he really felt. "You sent lawyers," Riven said finally. "You sent silence. You sent money. You never sent yourself." Caleb's jaw tightened. "I kept track. I knew you were safe. I just didn't think I'd be welcome." "You thought right," Selah snapped. One of the guards shifted slightly behind him. Caleb raised a hand, signaling them to stay back. "I didn't come to fight." "Then leave," Riven said. Caleb's expression faltered for the first time. "I came to see her. To tell her something I should have said a long time ago." "You had her number," Riven replied. "You had her address. You had options." Selah's voice, when it came again, was quieter, but colder. "You're our biological father, but not family." The sentence hung in the air like a line drawn in stone. Caleb's hands dropped to his sides. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He just stood there, exposed in a way power couldn't protect. He looked toward the room one last time. His lips parted, but no sound came. Then, slowly, he turned and walked away. The guards followed in silence. Caleb didn't return to the car right away. Instead, he stood outside the hospital entrance, hands buried in his coat pockets, jaw locked tight. His bodyguards lingered nearby, waiting for direction, but he didn't look at them. He couldn't. For the first time in a very long time, he had no control. He had prepared himself for anger. He expected resistance. What he didn't anticipate was the depth of what he'd missed. Not just birthdays and milestones, but connection, memory, identity. He had looked into the faces of his children and found no space for him in them. His mind wandered back to a conversation from 2 decades ago. Alara, standing on the threshold of his old apartment, holding a folded sonogram in one hand and her suitcase in the other. "I'm not asking for money," she had said. "I'm asking if you're capable of being present." At the time, he thought ambition was the higher calling, that by chasing success, he could offer them something better. Safety. Comfort. A future built on power, not struggle. But none of that mattered now. He hadn't just lost time. He had lost the right to belong. In the car, the silence was heavier than the ride itself. The driver said nothing. The bodyguards kept their gaze forward, and Caleb sat still, elbows on knees, eyes cast downward. For years he had built an empire brick by brick, startups, mergers, headlines, every achievement stacked high like a fortress. But none of it could be brought into that hospital room. Not one deal, not one patent, not one magazine cover could open the door he had just been turned away from. He went back to his hotel and didn't sleep. Instead, he stood by the window as the lights of the town flickered below. Everything felt smaller here, slower. He didn't mind. For once, he wasn't running toward anything. He was sitting with the weight of what he'd missed. There had been a moment, just before Selah spoke, that her eyes locked onto his. She didn't look scared. She looked sure. Her pain had matured into something sharper than rage, clarity, and Riven. The boy had his posture, his steadiness, his silence, but none of it was inherited. That discipline came from being raised without the fallback of a father. Caleb had not been forgotten. That would have been easier. He had been remembered and judged accordingly. The next morning, he called someone he hadn't spoken to in years. A college friend who once knew Alara too. They hadn't stayed close, but the man remembered her, and he had been the one to deliver the news in the first place. An accidental mention in a passing call that cracked something open in Caleb's chest. "She's strong," the man had said, "but she's not well. Thought you should know." That sentence haunted him, because Alara had always been strong. But strength wasn't supposed to be something a woman carried alone for 2 decades. Now, he was too late to catch up. He couldn't pretend to be part of the past. And the future? That wasn't his to shape either. But something inside him refused to leave it like this. Not for redemption, not even for forgiveness. He needed to say what he should have said years ago, not to clean his record, but to honor the person he once loved and the children he never knew. And so, he sat down. He opened a notebook, and he began to write. Not emails, not corporate statements, real words. Thoughts he hadn't faced, memories he'd buried under board meetings and schedules, apologies with no defense. He wrote until his hand cramped, then kept writing. And when he was done, he looked at the stack of pages, his first honest attempt at telling the truth. Not to change their minds, just to tell them what he should have before it all slipped away. It was on the 6th day of their hospital vigil that Sela noticed the bag. Tucked beneath Alara's chair was a small canvas tote, faded and worn, the kind she always carried when visiting the market or heading to the library. It had likely been packed. Quickly, no doubt by Riven during the chaos of that morning. Inside were the usual things, her favorite shawl, a paperback novel with a cracked spine, a tin of mints. And then, beneath those, something heavier. A leather-bound journal, edges softened by time, spine bent just slightly. Sela ran her fingers across the cover before opening it. The first page held no date, only a sentence. Some truths are too heavy to speak, so I wrote them down instead. Sela paused. She glanced toward the bed where her mother rested, her chest rising and falling slowly. Then she turned back to the book and began to read. Entry 1. You were never my mistake. You were my moment of clarity. That was the first line on the page. Sela turned it over, again and again in her mind. Her throat tightened. The journal was not a record of events. It was something more intimate, a place Alara had stored the things she never said aloud. Each page carried parts of her, reflections, doubts, memories soaked in emotion. There were entries written in short, clipped phrases, others in full paragraphs, flowing like confessions. Some were undated, some crossed out, but all of them felt alive. As Sela read, her hands grew still, and the rest of the world faded. Entry 5. I never hated him. That would have been easier. I just couldn't be where I wasn't chosen. That one struck deep. Sela closed the journal for a moment and stared at the floor. All her life, she had assumed her mother walked away because she had no other choice, that it was survival, that Calem's absence had been something she accepted but never forgave. But now, reading Alara's own words, she realized it had been more than that. It hadn't been about rejection. It had been about principle, about choosing self-worth over proximity. Hours passed. Sela found herself flipping pages as if chasing someone she thought she knew, only to meet her again for the first time. There were stories of laughter, about her first pregnancy cravings, about how Riven had kicked so hard it startled her in the middle of a grocery aisle. There were gentle notes about Sela's childhood tantrums and how her poetry notebooks began showing up in every room of the house. But threaded through all of it was one constant. Alara had never let bitterness set in. Even in the quiet hurt, she had written from a place of clarity, not blame. And then, tucked into the back cover, an envelope. It was thick, untitled. Inside were folded sheets, each in a different handwriting. Sela sat up straighter. The first page was unmistakably not Alara's. She recognized the signature at the bottom before reading the rest. Calem, letters, several of them, none addressed, none sent. She began to read. Letter 1, Calem, undated. I thought leaving was protecting you from me, but now I see that it was only protecting me from what I didn't know how to handle. Real love, real life, real responsibility. His words were flawed, but raw. No dressing, no pretense. The letters were written over years, based on their tone. Some defensive, others remorseful, but none arrogant. Each line carried a man trying to explain what he didn't understand until it was too late. He had watched from a distance, it seemed, knew of their milestones, heard whispers through old contacts, but he never reached out. Why? He answered that in one of the final pages. Success rewards movement, but love requires stillness. I never knew how to be still. Sela felt something shift in her. She wasn't ready to forgive, but now she was no longer sure what she had expected to find in him. A villain? A stranger? Instead, she found a flawed man who had traded the only people who loved him for applause from people who never would. She wiped her eyes, closed the envelope, and placed it back inside the journal. Her fingers trembled. That night, she sat beside her mother's bed and read one of the entries aloud, quietly, like a whisper passed between generations. That night, Selah waited until the hallway quieted. Machines beeped softly in the distance, and the air held the kind of stillness that only comes when everything else has been said, or when there's nothing left to say. She sat in the chair beside Alara's bed, opened the journal again, and began to read. Not silently this time. Out loud. Her voice was gentle, barely more than a whisper, but clear. Sometimes I think love is less about the big promises and more about the quiet decisions you make when no one's watching. I left not because I stopped loving him, but because I refused to keep loving alone. Selah paused. Her fingers gripped the edge of the page. She looked over at Alara, who was still resting, her breathing calm but shallow. Riven entered quietly and sat on the windowsill. He didn't speak. He just listened. Selah kept reading. There were mornings I hated myself for missing him. I wondered if strength meant pretending I didn't. But strength, I've learned, is telling the truth without expecting it to change anything. The room felt heavier, but not in a way that pressed down. It felt full, filled with all the things they never knew about the woman who had carried them through life like a secret gift. Selah turned to the envelope again and pulled out the shortest of Calem's letters. She didn't read it aloud. Not yet, but she held it like something fragile. She looked at Riven. He wrote to her, she said softly. A few times, never sent them. Riven's eyes stayed fixed on the floor. Do you think she read them? I think she kept them close. A beat passed. Then Selah unfolded the letter again. This time, she read it aloud. Calem's letter, excerpt. You were the first person who saw me when I was still nothing. Before the headlines, before the title. You looked at me like I was already enough, and I didn't know how to carry that. Riven exhaled slowly. It was strange hearing their father's voice like this, not booming from a screen, not filtered through reputation, but as a man trying to explain himself with no audience to impress. Selah folded the page. She didn't shield us from him, she said. She shielded us from pain. And she carried it instead, Riven replied. Selah closed the journal gently. We only ever knew half the story. Riven leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees. Maybe that's why she never said much. Maybe she didn't want us to think of him as a villain, or to romanticize him either. She wanted us to see people as people, even when they failed her. They sat in silence for a while after that, not because there was nothing to say, but because there was finally space to feel. If this story touches something in you, share it with someone who believes in second chances, or someone who needs to. Later that evening, as Alara stirred slightly and whispered their names in her sleep, Selah sat back down beside her. She didn't open the journal again. She simply held her mother's hand and whispered, You weren't alone, Mama. You were never alone. And for the first time since the hospital doors opened, it no longer felt like they were defending her. It felt like they were finally understanding her. He came back without an announcement. No guards, no expensive car waiting at the curb. Just him. There was no suit this time, only a gray sweater, wrinkled at the sleeves, and a quietness about him that didn't need to be explained. His steps were slower, less practiced. He moved through the hospital lobby with a sense of weight, not the kind carried by pressure, but the kind that comes from shame, too long ignored. Riven saw him first. He didn't speak. He simply watched as Calem approached, stopping just before the hallway that led to Alara's room. I'm not here to cause trouble, Calem said. I just want to sit, nothing more. His voice was rougher, not broken, just thinner. Selah stepped out behind Riven, arms folded, her expression unreadable. He looked at her, then looked down. I don't expect anything, he added. Not answers, not forgiveness, just time near her. Riven looked at his sister. They didn't speak. They didn't have to. That had always been their way. Selah stepped forward. You don't get to walk in and be part of the story now. This is still her chapter. I know, Calem replied. I'm not trying to write anything. Selah studied him. She expected a man who would argue, who would throw around what he thought he deserved. Instead, she found someone who looked tired, not in the physical sense, but in the way someone looks after running from themselves for too long. You waited too long, she said. I know, he whispered. The silence between them was no longer hostile. It was wounded. What do you want from her? She asked. Nothing, Calem said. Just a moment. That's all. Riven nodded slowly. 5 minutes? Calum looked up. That's more than I deserve. Selah stepped aside. He entered the room alone. Ilara was asleep, her breathing steady. The light from the hallway cut softly across the bed, outlining the curve of her cheek, the slope of her shoulders under the blanket. He took a chair and sat. He didn't speak right away. He just looked at her, not as the woman he lost, but as the one he never really saw in full. His fingers tightened around the notebook he brought, the one filled with the words he wrote when sleep wouldn't come. But he didn't open it. Instead, he leaned forward. I didn't know how to choose you, he said quietly. Not because I didn't love you, but because I didn't know how to give something I hadn't learned to carry. Ilara didn't stir. He continued anyway. I chose noise, the kind that drowns out silence. I thought winning meant never being vulnerable, but it just made me forget how to stay still when something beautiful stood in front of me. He reached for her hand, but didn't touch it. I remember everything. You had a laugh that didn't need an audience, and I always wanted one. That was the difference. He took a breath. I spent years building things no one remembers, and the only ones who would have remembered me for something real, I walked away from. His voice cracked, but he kept speaking. You deserved someone who stayed. You gave me a choice, and I chose myself. I told myself it was for the right reasons, but it wasn't. It was fear. He looked at her again. You stayed strong so long, I started thinking you didn't need anyone. But the truth is, I just didn't have the courage to show up when it mattered. He leaned back in the chair, wiped his eyes quickly. If you don't open your eyes again, I'll understand. If this is the end of the line, I won't ask for anything. He stood, gently placed the notebook on the table beside her bed. But if you do, I'll still be here. Selah waited until Calum stepped out of the room before she said a word. She'd been standing just out of sight, arms at her sides, jaw clenched. Not out of rage, but restraint. She wasn't sure which was heavier, watching her mother sleep or watching the man who once abandoned them speak with the kind of grief that couldn't be faked. Calum closed the door gently behind him. He didn't look at her. Not at first. I didn't expect you to let me in, he said, voice low. I almost didn't. He nodded. I didn't come here to make anything right. I know that's not how it works. I just needed to say what I couldn't carry anymore. Selah stepped forward slowly. I read your letters. He looked up sharply. Not defensive, surprised. She kept them, she added. Tucked between journal pages. I didn't know if she ever read them. She did. Silence again. This time not out of distance, but tension neither one of them knew how to hold. Selah's eyes didn't soften, but they weren't cold either. You wrote things that made sense, she said. But you also wrote them to someone who already did the hard part. Alone. I know. She didn't need your words. She needed your presence. And you didn't give it. Calum exhaled through his nose. I wasn't built for presence. Everything I learned growing up told me that showing up was secondary to succeeding. That's not an excuse, she said sharply. It's not, he agreed. He paused. I'm not asking you to see me differently. I don't even deserve that. But I came back because I finally saw myself clearly, and I hated what I saw. Selah looked at him for a long time. Not like someone waiting for a confession, but someone deciding what she would allow next. My mother didn't wait for you, she said. She didn't carry hope like some badge. She made peace with the fact that you chose something else. Calum nodded. And yet, she never turned us against you. That's what broke me, he whispered. You should have hated me. It would have been easier, cleaner, but she protected my memory, even when I gave her nothing to work with. Selah felt her throat tighten. She believed people were more than their choices, but she also believed choices matter. I made all the wrong ones, he said. But you're here now. Calum looked at her. I am. Selah's expression shifted. Not forgiveness, not understanding, just recognition that the man in front of her was no longer the one who vanished without explanation. She might wake up, or she might not, Selah said quietly. I'll stay either way, and if she doesn't want to see you, I'll sit outside the room, Calum replied, and I won't ask why. She nodded once. I'm not going to tell you we're fine, she said, but I will tell you that I don't feel the same today as I did the first time you walked in. That's more than I expected. Selah turned toward the hallway, then looked back. You're still learning, she said. Calum smiled faintly. Seems I've got a lot to catch up on. They sat across from each other in the waiting area, Selah curled in her chair, legs pulled close, Riven hunched forward, elbows on his knees. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The hospital had a strange kind of silence at night. It wasn't peaceful. It was aware. Every beep from a monitor, every low murmur from down the hall, only made the silence between them louder. Selah broke it first. "Do you think we're doing the right thing?" Riven didn't answer immediately. He knew what she meant. She wasn't talking about treatment plans or medication. She was talking about him. "Calum, I don't know," he said quietly. Selah let her head rest against the wall. "I hate that he's here, but I also hate how I don't completely hate it." Riven looked over at her. She wasn't crying, but her voice had that familiar weight, the kind she used when her emotions weren't loud, but heavy. "I keep thinking about her," she continued, "about how she looked at him, even in her sleep, like there was still some part of her that remembered. She never closed that door completely," Riven said. "And what does that mean for us?" Riven leaned back, staring at the ceiling. "I don't think it means we forgive him for her. I think it means we ask whether we're willing to stop carrying the weight she already let go of." Selah sat up. "So, if we let him be here, are we betraying her?" "I don't think so," he said. "Even if he doesn't deserve it. Especially if he doesn't." She looked at him, confused. Riven met her gaze. "She raised us to understand people, not to excuse them, but to recognize when they're trying." "He's decades too late," Selah whispered. "I know." They both sat in that space for a while, between anger and something else they hadn't named yet. "He said he didn't know how to choose her," she said. Riven didn't respond. "That line keeps playing in my head. Because it's honest," he finally said. "And heartbreaking," Selah added. They sat in silence again, but this one felt different, less tense, more thoughtful. Back in Alara's room, the machines continued their quiet rhythm. She had opened her eyes once that day, just for a moment, just long enough to look at Selah and mouth her name, just long enough to squeeze Riven's hand before drifting off again. She was still here, but she was far away too. "Do you believe forgiveness is more for the forgiver than the forgiven? Let us know below." Riven looked down at his hands. She wouldn't want to leave this life with anger as the last thing he felt from her. Selah nodded slowly. "She wouldn't want us carrying it either. So maybe it's not about what he deserves," Riven said. "Maybe it's about what she deserves." "A calm goodbye," Selah murmured. "A door not slammed shut." Riven gave a soft nod. "She always said we don't choose how people enter our lives, but we can choose how they leave it." That line hit deep. Selah stood, walked to the window, arms crossed tight across her chest. She stared out for a while before she spoke again. "We let him speak to her, one time, quietly. No promises," Riven added. "No expectations," Selah agreed. She turned back to him. "Just a moment." Riven stood beside her. "That's all he asked for." Calum hadn't left the hospital. He spent the night in the lobby, sitting alone in a corner chair by the vending machines. No coat folded over his lap. No phone in his hand. Just stillness. He wasn't trying to look pitiful. He wasn't asking anyone for attention. And that, more than anything, is what made the moment feel different. By morning, the nurse at the front desk recognized him. She nodded quietly as he sat up and stretched. His back ached, his neck stiff, but he didn't complain. He had nowhere else to be. And that, finally, felt right. Riven and Selah approached just after sunrise. Calum stood as they arrived. He didn't ask questions. He didn't assume. Riven spoke first. "She's still resting." Selah followed. "We're not giving you a chance to rewrite anything. We're giving her a moment she might want." Calum nodded. "I won't take more than I'm allowed." Selah looked at him closely. "If she opens her eyes and tells you to leave, you leave. I will. And if she says nothing at all, you say what you came to say and let her rest." "I understand." There was no handshake, no smile, just quiet agreement between people who knew the rules mattered more than the feelings. Riven led the way down the hall. Selah walked behind, arms folded. At the door, Calum paused. He looked back at both of them, not for reassurance, but to acknowledge their trust, small as it was. Then he stepped inside. Alara looked unchanged, eyes closed, hands resting gently atop the blanket. the same quiet rise and fall of her chest. He pulled the chair closer and sat. No pageantry, no rehearsed words. Just him and time that couldn't be returned. He didn't start with apologies. He didn't try to explain the past. He simply began with the one truth he hadn't been brave enough to say aloud. I missed you. His voice cracked, not from volume but from weight. I missed the way you made me quiet without saying a word, the way you never needed to be the loudest person in the room to lead it. He looked at her, as if searching for a flicker of response. None came, so he kept going. I thought love was supposed to chase success, that if I gave you everything money could buy, you'd understand I cared. But you didn't want that. You wanted someone who came home. He paused. I didn't know how to be that person then, and by the time I did, you had already learned how to live without me. His fingers brushed the notebook he had left on her table the day before. I don't know if you'll hear this, but if you do, thank you. He sat back, for raising them better than I ever could, for not letting my absence turn into bitterness, for still being the kind of person who kept my letters even when I didn't deserve to be remembered. The room remained quiet, but it didn't feel empty. He reached for her hand, just gently, and this time she moved. Not much, just the faintest twitch of her fingers against his. His breath caught. He didn't speak again. He didn't move. He just sat there, holding the moment like it was glass. Because it was. Outside, Selah and Riven stood by the window. They didn't look through the door. They didn't eavesdrop. They simply waited. For once, not with anger, but with acceptance. Because forgiveness, they had come to learn, wasn't about restoring what once was. It was about freeing what still remained. When Alara opened her eyes, the room was dim and still. The quiet hum of nearby machines was familiar by now, almost comforting. She blinked slowly, adjusting to the light, then turned her head, just slightly, to the side. He was there. Calum sat beside her, shoulders drawn, hands resting in his lap, gaze fixed. On the floor as though he were afraid to look up and find her gone again. She didn't speak right away. She didn't need to. He looked up when he felt her eyes on him. And just like that, after years of silence, they were face to face. She gave him a faint nod. He cleared his throat, unsure where to begin. He looked older than she remembered. Not just in appearance, but in posture. The sharpness had faded. What remained was something quieter. I didn't expect to see you, she said softly. I wasn't sure I'd be allowed. You weren't. There was no anger in her voice, just truth. He nodded. I understand. Alara studied him for a long time. You've changed. Calum hesitated before answering. I had to. She closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, her voice had steadied just enough. So, why are you here? I came to say, I'm sorry. For what? For all of it. That's vague, she whispered, not unkindly. Calum looked down again. I'm sorry for leaving when I should have stayed, for thinking success made me worthy when what you asked for was presence. I'm sorry for thinking of you only when it was convenient, and I'm sorry for not understanding what I had until it was already lost. Alara didn't respond. Her fingers gently picked at the edge of her blanket. Calum continued, I don't want anything from you. Not forgiveness, not comfort. I just didn't want you to leave this world thinking I never cared. She looked at him, her eyes more alert now. You cared, but not enough to be brave. He nodded slowly. Yes, you were afraid to fail, but love isn't earned through perfection. I know that now. She gave a small, tired sigh. I waited for you once, and then I stopped waiting. That was my healing. He swallowed hard. I'm not asking you to go back. You can't go back, she said, but you can tell me what you came to say. Calum paused, then leaned in, just a bit closer. I should have chosen you, not quietly, not halfway. I should have stood beside you when it mattered. And you didn't. No. Alara studied his face, not to judge it, but to remember it fully. You're still learning, she said. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The space between their words was filled only with the quiet sounds of the machines that monitored her fading strength. Calum shifted in his seat, then spoke again, gently this time, without effort to control the moment. Do you remember the cafe in Boston? Her lips lifted slightly. You ordered black coffee and spilled half of it when you tried to act cool. He smiled. I told you it was vintage charm. She turned her head slightly toward him. It was an awful jacket. He let out a breath that might have been a laugh if it weren't so full of regret. I kept it, he said, even after everything. It sat in the back of my closet for years. Couldn't bring myself to throw it out, because it reminded you of the part of yourself you abandoned. He nodded. Yeah. Ilara's eyes softened. You were never all bad, just unfinished. Caleb looked away for a moment. I thought I had to prove something. To the world, to myself, to a version of success that never once stopped to ask if I was happy. And were you? No, he said. Not once. She breathed quietly for a while before answering. I had dreams too. None of them involved raising children alone, but I wouldn't change them. Not a single part. I believe that, he said. They're extraordinary. They are, she whispered. And I wish you had known them. I'm starting to. She turned her gaze toward the small table beside the bed. A photo rested there, a younger version of herself, smiling, eyes full of mischief and conviction. The life she could have lived was in that photo. And yet, she didn't look at it with longing. Only recognition. You missed most of my life, she said. But you're here now. And for what little time I have left, I'd rather not waste it holding on to what's already done. His voice cracked slightly when he spoke next. I never stopped loving you, but I didn't know how to show it in a way that meant anything. She didn't answer right away. Then, with slow care, she reached for his hand, not out of sentiment, but choice. I know. They sat there, her hand resting lightly in his. No more words offered. None needed. When the nurse entered to adjust her pillow, Caleb stepped back. Ilara closed her eyes, and for the first time since his return, her face looked calm. Not because everything had been repaired, but because she had finally been heard. The doctors didn't use the word recovery. They said stabilization. It meant the crisis had passed, for now. It meant that Ilara was still fragile, still under careful watch, but her body was no longer slipping downward as quickly as before. For Riven and Selah, that small improvement felt like breathing after holding their lungs still for days. She was awake longer now, alert enough to hold full conversations, sometimes tired, sometimes clear-eyed, but always aware. They didn't crowd her. They stayed close but allowed her rest. They made her tea when she asked. They adjusted pillows. Riven brought in her favorite book. Selah read softly when Ilara's hands felt too weak to turn the pages. And through it all, Caleb remained, not hovering, not inserting himself, just present. He didn't ask to be included, but he didn't leave either. He found a small place in the waiting lounge each morning and sat with a book or a notepad. No calls, no laptop, just him. Eventually, Ilara asked that he sit with her again. Once in the morning, once in the evening, brief, calm visits. Selah noticed the way Ilara's voice changed when he was near, softer but not uncertain, like she was reaching for a memory and anchoring it in the present. When Ilara was discharged for home observation, Caleb offered to leave. I've said what I needed, he told Riven. I don't want to stay where I'm not wanted. But Riven didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward their mother, resting in her own bed, sunlight falling across her blanket, and then looked back at the man who had once walked away from it all. You should stay, Riven said. Caleb nodded, saying nothing more. The farmhouse welcomed him like it didn't remember the years he missed. He took the guest room at the back, the one Ilara used to rent out in the summers. He made his own bed, washed his own dishes, asked permission before opening cabinets. He didn't try to reclaim any space. He simply learned to share it. Selah watched him closely those first few days. Quietly, curiously, not with suspicion, but with care. He noticed. One afternoon, she walked into the kitchen to find him struggling with the oven. I'm trying to make her soup, he said, holding a spoon and staring into a pot like it had personally betrayed him. She doesn't like rosemary, Selah said. He blinked. I added a lot of rosemary. She took the spoon from his hand, dipped it, tasted it, then added a bit of salt. Caleb stepped back. I thought cooking was simple. It is, until it's not. They worked side by side in silence. When the soup was finished, they both tasted it again. Better, he admitted. Still too much rosemary. He laughed under his breath. Selah almost smiled. Later that week, Riven invited him to see a small project he'd been developing, a community, platform designed to connect local tech students with small-town businesses. Calum listened as Riven explained the logic behind the framework, the coding structure, the potential impact. He didn't interrupt. He didn't lecture. He just nodded and asked questions that mattered. "Your backend's clean," he said finally, "but you'll need to scale your storage differently once the beta grows." Riven raised a brow. "You kept up?" Calum smiled faintly. "I built some things before I built the wrong things." They spent the next hour reviewing the architecture occasionally, scribbling on paper, passing ideas back and forth like chess moves. It was the first time Riven looked at him and didn't see absence. Sela brought out her notebook the next night, the one she never let anyone read from. She didn't hand it to him, but she left it on the table while she stepped away to make tea. When she returned, he was still seated, hands folded, eyes not on the book, but on the floor. "I didn't open it," he said. She sat down. "I left it there for a reason." He didn't reach for it. "I'll read it when you're ready for me to." She didn't respond right away, then quietly said, "I want you to hear my voice, not just my words. Whenever you're ready." That night, she read aloud to him. Short lines, careful rhythm, words soaked in years she never voiced. He listened with the kind of silence that only happens when someone finally understands what it means to receive something precious. Alara watched all of it. From the hallway, from the porch, from the comfort of her favorite chair, wrapped in a blanket the twins had gifted her years ago. She saw her children speaking freely. She saw a man learning, not trying to undo the past, but learning how not to repeat it. She didn't call it healing. She didn't call it redemption. She simply called it time well spent. Snow had begun to settle softly outside the windows. Vermont was quiet in winter, and so was the house. Alara sat in her favorite chair, legs covered in a knitted blanket. A cup of warm broth rested on the side table. The sharp edges in her face had softened, not from weakness, but from something else. Lightness, not quite laughter, not quite ease, but something close. Calum entered the room slowly, holding a folded sweater. "You left this in the kitchen," he said. "I wondered where it went," she replied. He handed it over, then sat down opposite her. For a while, neither spoke. They didn't need to. The silence didn't carry tension anymore. It held understanding. Alara reached for her cup. Her hand trembled slightly, but she managed it without help. He didn't rush to assist. He'd learned that lesson early. Alara helped when asked, and she accepted help the same way. She took a sip. "Do you remember the jacket?" she asked suddenly. He blinked. "The leather one?" She nodded. "It made you look like you got lost on the way to a biker bar." He laughed under his breath. "You told me it was bold." "I lied. Why'd you let me wear it on our first date?" "Because it was raining, and I figured if I judged you too soon, I'd miss the better parts." He grinned. "I thought I looked confident. You looked confused." Their laughter was soft, slow, the kind that didn't need to stretch far to mean something. "I kept that jacket," he said. Alara raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "I think I thought it held the part of me you loved." She didn't answer right away. "You thought too much about what to become," she said, "and not enough about who to be." "I know." Calum leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I look back and I barely recognize the man who let you go. I thought success needed solitude. I thought building a future meant leaving everything behind that wasn't efficient. And love was never efficient. No, but it was real." She watched him carefully. "And now, I don't want to build anything that doesn't have a place for stillness, or for you, or for them." Alara set her cup down slowly. "You waited too long." "I did." She tilted her head slightly. "But you waited for the right reason this time." Calum looked at her with quiet surprise. "What reason was that?" "You weren't trying to win." Alara leaned back in her chair, eyes drifting toward the window where snow touched the branches like a whisper. She didn't speak for a moment, just watched the way winter arrived without apology. Slow, steady, certain. "I used to wonder," she said quietly, "what it would have been like if you'd stayed, if we'd raised them together. If I hadn't walked away." Calum didn't respond right away. "I used to wonder too," he said, "until I realized I never gave you the option to believe I'd stay." She nodded slowly. "I had to let go before the weight broke me. I understand now." Another silence passed. It wasn't filled with regret, but with recognition. Alara turned toward him. I don't regret choosing them over waiting for you. But I missed what we could have been if you'd known how to be present. I missed it too, he said. But I missed knowing you more. She looked down at her hands. They know who you are now. They see you trying. I hope that's enough to build something honest. It's not about what you hope, she said gently. It's about what you show, over time, with consistency. Caleb gave a quiet nod. I'm here. She smiled, not brightly, but fully. I see that. He sat back and let the moment settle between them. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing against the windows like a soft reminder of time passing. Inside, everything was still. Elara reached toward the photo on the side table, a younger version of herself, standing near a lake, eyes open to the world. She handed it to him. You missed her, she said, but I think you're just in time for who I am now. Caleb took the frame gently. She's still in there. She's older, wiser, a little tired. He smiled. Still beautiful. Her eyes met his. You're softer now, less noise. I had to lose everything to understand what mattered. Sometimes, she said, it takes being quiet to finally hear yourself. They didn't speak after that. She rested her head against the back of the chair. He stayed seated beside her. And in the hush of that winter evening, they said more in silence than words could have ever carried. Elara passed in her sleep just before dawn. There was no struggle, no sudden shift, only quiet. Seela had been resting on the couch across the room when the stillness became more than rest. Riven came in moments later, holding 2 mugs of tea. One slipped from his hand when he saw her face. Neither of them spoke. They walked her together, taking her hands gently, folding them over her chest. Her expression hadn't changed, peaceful, as if she'd finally exhaled everything she had ever held back. Caleb entered quietly behind them. He stood in the doorway, unsure whether to step forward, but Seela looked at him once and gave a small nod. He moved beside them, placed his hand lightly over hers, and whispered something none of them could hear, and none of them asked. The funeral was simple, just the way Elara would have wanted. A few close friends, a handful of neighbors, the kind of service where no one pretended she had lived a perfect life, but everyone could agree that she had lived a meaningful one. Seela read one of her poems, one Elara had written in her journal during her final hospital stay. It wasn't about loss or sorrow. It was about choosing softness, even when the world gave you reasons to be hard. Riven stood last. He looked out at the small gathering, then down at the folded paper in his hand. He held it for a while before finally speaking. I'm not going to read this, he said. He looked over at his sister, at Caleb, at the seat where their mother used to sit during community meetings. Empty now. I want to speak from where it matters. He paused. My mother taught us a lot of things. Most of them weren't lessons she announced. She just lived them. She showed us that strength isn't about volume, that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and that love doesn't always show up clean or convenient. His voice stayed steady, but his hands were clenched. She taught us that love isn't always tidy, but it's real, and when it's real, you fight for it, not with shouting, not with drama, but with choice, with showing up, with staying. He looked down for a moment, then back at the crowd. She chose to raise us without resentment. She chose to tell the truth without using it as a weapon. And she chose, right until the end, to make space for grace. He folded the paper again, unread. I hope we choose the same. Riven stepped down. He didn't need applause. The silence that followed meant more. After the burial, the 3 of them returned to the farmhouse. The air was quiet. The living room untouched. The chair she used to sit in still faced the window, just as she'd left it. They didn't say much that evening, but as night fell, they sat together on the porch, wrapped in blankets, sipping the tea she had always kept stocked in the cupboard, not to mourn, but to honor, not to rewrite, but to remember. If this story moved you, subscribe for more powerful narratives, and don't forget to comment, because every story deserves to be shared. Spring returned slowly. The snow melted from the porch rails first, then from the edges of the garden beds Elara once tended. The house felt different without her, but it didn't feel empty. There were traces of her in every corner, the way the books were arranged, the scent of her favorite tea, the handwritten labels still taped inside the pantry. Caleb didn't leave. Not after the service, not after the guests faded away. He unpacked fully for the first time in years. Not into a hotel, not into a penthouse, but into a life. He bought a second-hand truck from the neighbor down the road, started waking early, took long walks alone, not to plan, not to calculate, just to breathe. Some days he helped Selah prepare the garden Alara had always meant to restart. Some days he stood beside Riven in a local co-working space, helping him finalize the non-profit paperwork for the new tech co-op. It was Riven's vision. But Caleb listened, asked good questions, and didn't try to take over. That mattered. Riven named the co-op after Alara, not her first name, not her last, just Hearth, because that's what she had been. Selah's poetry book was released in the summer. A small independent press published it. The title was borrowed from one of Alara's final journal entries, Some Things We Carry Twice. The poems weren't just about grief. They were about holding space, about growing up in silence and learning to speak anyway, about watching your mother choose dignity over bitterness and realizing one day that it saved you. At the launch event, Selah didn't thank Caleb by name, but she looked at him once, toward the back of the bookstore, and gave a nod that said enough. Afterward, he asked her to sign his copy. She smiled, wrote a short line in the front cover, and closed the book before he could read it. Evenings became their rhythm. The three of them, once spread across different emotional maps, began sharing the porch again. It didn't happen all at once, but slowly, consistently. Caleb brewed tea now. He didn't talk much during those hours. He listened. Sometimes Selah would read aloud. Sometimes Riven would share updates from his students at the co-op. And sometimes they all just watched the sun fold itself into the hills, saying nothing at all. There were no speeches, no declarations of healing, just time and presence. One afternoon, Caleb found himself sitting alone after the twins had gone inside. He looked out over the open yard, the garden, the old rocking chair where Alara once read on warm afternoons. He thought about how much he had missed, not just in years, but in moments. He had lost the chance to be their father in the traditional sense, but he hadn't lost the chance to be steady now. That thought didn't bring comfort. It brought clarity. Some bridges couldn't be rebuilt, but some doors opened again, not because the past had been repaired, but because the present had finally been respected. Alara wasn't there anymore, but in every act of kindness that now lived in that home, she still echoed. Selah's laughter, Riven's quiet guidance, Caleb's choice to stay when leaving would have been easier. They didn't use the word family too much. They didn't need to. The sun dipped below the tree line. The porch lights flicked on. Caleb stood, picked up the teacups and stepped inside to wash them. The house was quiet, but it was not alone. Love didn't save them, but it gave them something to live for.